Welcome to the launch of the 9060 XT featuring the Sapphire Nitro Plus 9060 XT and also on Linux. Well, we're going to test Windows as well, but Linux natively day 0 support, although I guess technically day 1 support because the cards launched yesterday, but they're hitting retail availability today at the time this video is going live, which is exciting. And you know what else is exciting? That Linux works as well as it does. Let's take a look at the Nitro Plus, because this is also the fastest 9060 XT that I'm going to have as part of my launch coverage. I'm reviewing 3 9060 XTs for launch, so check out all the videos, a full launch video on the main channel, but here on the Linux channel, we're going to take a look at the Nitro Plus, and in a Linux context, as well as Windows context. So let's get started. First up, fit and finish on this card, it is a triple slot card. There's 3 outputs, 2 HDMI and 1 DisplayPort. That's HDMI 2.1 as well as DisplayPort 2.1. That'll drive up to 8K at 120 Hz. It's not the full DisplayPort 2.1, but it is enough of a DisplayPort 2.1 that it will keep my 4K 240 Hz monitor happy, especially for desktop resolutions. Now, this card is not meant to play games at 4K. It's really meant for 1080p and 1440p, and I gotta say it's a pretty solid experience on Linux for that. This card also, I mentioned, is the fastest in the benchmarks. It's because the total board power here for this card is upwards of 185 watts, even a little beyond that in my measuring. Nevertheless, in our Fractal Terra case here, it's whisper quiet, thanks to its triple fan design and probably overkill heatsink. This is a much larger heatsink than we've seen even on 250, 300 watt cards, so that helps the card operate overall at lower temperatures, at least as reported by Hardware Info 64 on Windows, and reasonable noise levels. Almost inaudible noise levels in most scenarios. Now, it has a single 8-pin power connector. It is PCIe Gen 5, 16 lanes. I tested it with a 9800X3D as well as our 13900HX system. I was sort of curious about how it would perform with an older-ish system. And this is a mobile CPU. It's a Minis Forum motherboard. And I just wanted to see how it would perform there. And it turns out there's really not a huge difference between those two. Most of the time your GPU bottlenecked even at 1080p at medium and high settings, so as a practical matter there's not a huge performance difference between a 9800X3D and an older 13900H. The max boost clock I was seeing out of this card was 3320, and the game clock was up to about 2780 give or take. This is a card that's got 32 ray tracing accelerators, 64 AI accelerators. It has 32 megs of AMD Infinity Cache. I mean, the 9060 XT specs should be second nature to you now if you're looking to buy a 9060 XT for your gaming. The 9060 XT prices start at $349. However, this is Nitro Plus. This is overclocked out of the box. This is tuned out of the box. It is kind of sort of a dual BIOS configuration. You have to use the Trix software to pick between an A and a B BIOS. So it's on almost not quite dual BIOS situation, but you can tune things and save it to the card, and this is nice because of the Linux scenario. There's also some tuning tools for Linux that have started to show up that work really well, but that's something we could discuss in another video. 3 outputs, 3 displays. That's, you might not, it's like, oh, 4 displays all the time. Nah, costs had to be saved somewhere. 3 outputs on this, 2 HDMI, 1 DisplayPort, as I said before. So just, make sure that it's worth repeating. It's worth saying twice. That's really the downside with Linux, with Linux, dual DisplayPort and 1 HDMI would be a more preferable situation. But I was testing this on HDMI with our OLED and kernel 6.15 and day 0 support, and it's been working fine. Although DisplayPort is better on Linux, to be clear. The thermal interface material is the PTM 7950 that we've all come to know and love from Honeywell. Good job, Honeywell. So in other words, nothing I've encountered with this card is anything unexpected. It is the superior Sapphire build quality, and they've done a really good job putting the card together. It's fully enclosed. There's some features here that would help prevent it from sagging. It doesn't matter in my vertical configuration here, but they've done a good job with the fit and finish of this card. It also has an extra ARGB header that you can plug in an RGB strip to if you want to have your graphics card control that. It also has its own built-in ARGB that you can control through software. So, neat. Triple fan design. Again, overcool, maximum cooling. So let's start with the Windows benchmarks. And this will be a fun little comparison between Windows and Linux. Although I don't want to get super hung up on the whole Windows versus Linux thing. I just want to show that the performance is close enough to parity at this point, even cross-platform, that yeah, good job Linux, good job Steam, good job Team Proton, good job AMD making sure that this works. But let's start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, we're talking about 216 FPS. Not bad, not bad at all. At 1440p, if we step it up, we're still getting 145 FPS. Now, depending on if you watch other reviews and you look at other Windows benchmarks, there was a Windows update on March 27th, 28th that for just my machine, for whatever reason, negatively impacted on the 1% lows. Like the 1% lows were wildly out of line with the other GPUs. I just want to call that out here because if you see that elsewhere, and it's like, why are your numbers different? It's like, because I noticed something was wrong. Just saying that. Of course, I say that and it'll turn out to be only a me problem. Or everybody else caught it too. All right, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Shadows, because this is pretty interesting, I think. And this is a great result for Sapphire in particular, because with frame gen off at 1080p, the Sapphire 9060 XT is pulling well ahead of the 5060 Ti Prime. Well, ahead a bit. The 1% lows were better, in my opinion. The stack here looks really good, especially with 1X frame gen. 1X frame gen is pulling ahead of the 5060 Ti and the NVIDIA 4070 Founders Edition. And subjectively, not objectively, playing on the fancy pants OLED display, because it's like butter for your eyes, this is how I would play Assassin's Creed. If not 1440p at 1080p. Now, at 1440p, if we step things up just a little bit, again, this is with ray tracing on, it's still pretty awesome. Even with frame gen off, it's doing pretty well. We're almost maintaining 60 FPS pretty solid with FreeSync. When we dip a little below it, you don't notice. So this is a very, very good experience for the high preset in Assassin's Creed Shadows. The contrast to this is that the multi-frame gen experience in Assassin's Creed Shadows, especially at 1440p, was a juddery mess on the 5060 Ti. I don't think it was a good gaming experience. I mean, sure, the top line frame rate number there is amazing, 175 FPS. But even with FreeSync, 41 FPS for our 1% lows, you could really, it was not an enjoyable experience when you experience that kind of thing in your gameplay. 1X frame gen on the 5060 Ti was fine. Like, that was not a terrible experience. I mean, our 1% lows are like 45 FPS, and you definitely can feel it, but it wasn't, it wasn't unplayable, in my opinion. I might actually get motion sick or something if I were playing 4X frame gen on the 5060 Ti for multi-frame gen, like 4X at 1440p. I would probably play this with 1X frame gen at 1440p or 1080p on this card, and it's a good experience. Like, I think it's a good experience, my opinion, but these are the numbers, and it's also really important, like if you're comparing performance of multiple cards, it is important to compare the performance with frame gen off so you get an idea of how things work with frame gen off. And, all four of these cards weren't completely terrible. Well, except maybe the B580 at 1440p, but at 1080p it was fine. Cyberpunk is another one of those games that's really interesting when we look at how it performs and like the ray tracing demands, and then it's like this is an inexpensive card. Like, how deep did they cut ray tracing? And so that's why I look at Assassin's Creed and Cyberpunk to try to figure out how these things stack up. And Cyberpunk is interesting with the 5060 Ti because I was just crapping all over multi-frame gen, but 4X multi-frame gen, even on the 5060 Ti, was not as terrible as it was on Assassin's Creed. It was okay-ish. I probably still wouldn't play 4X frame gen on Cyberpunk, and that may be because I actually enjoy 4X frame gen on like a 5090 on Cyberpunk, running at some absurd resolution with some absurd display. It's kind of fun, but the 5060 Ti it's struggling too much with multi-frame gen in this scenario, even at 1080, even on medium. But the Sapphire 9060 XT with 1X frame gen, and even without 1X frame gen, is holding its own here. The performance is very similar across all four cards with frame gen disabled, and the Sapphire 9060 XT was doing really well with 1X, the 1X, like letting it do its frame gen thing for the medium RT preset. And keep in mind, these settings with FSR Auto, there's a little bit of variability there. So this is more subjective than objective before you freak out. Now, Monster Hunter Wilds, with the high preset, with ray tracing disabled, the 9060 XT came out on top of here, even ahead of the 5060 Ti, which is very, very impressive. 107 FPS average. With ray tracing, the 9060 XT still ahead of the 5060 Ti at 101 FPS average. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, about 73 FPS. Now, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle testing, so there was a Windows update a couple of days ago that I mentioned nuked the 1% lows. It also nuked my ability to test Indiana Jones and the Great Circle correctly on the 5060 Ti. So I fiddled around with it for a little bit and I ran out of time for this review. So it was in the same ballpark, but 73 FPS is above 60, and that's a pretty good experience at 1440p. And remember, if you step it down from 1440p to 1080p, you're going to get 100 FPS, which is pretty good. Now, because it's Windows, we also want to do artificial benchmarks, 3D Mark Firestrike. The Sapphire 9060 XT is lining up about where I would expect. It's pulling some pretty good numbers here because, again, this card's got a built-in overclock. It's using 185, 190 watts. It's the single 8-pin power connector still, but it's getting her done. The 9060 XT still falls behind a little bit in the OpenCL benchmarks, and surprisingly, the Vulkan benchmarks, the 5060 Ti and the 4070, still pull ahead. It's also kind of surprising how much better the 4070 Founders Edition is than the 5060 Ti Prime. Remember the days when like the 60 series of the new generation was as good or better than the 70 series of the previous generation? Guess those days are gone. Anyway, Port Royal, this is a good result for the Sapphire 9060 XT. It's not a lot different from the 5060 Ti or the 4070 Founders Edition, so you're going to have a pretty good gaming experience here. Our text generation scores, the 9060 XT pulled better scores than the 9060 XT, the other variants of the 9060 XT that I'm testing, but it was within a few percentage points. You can do text generation with this, but this is something obviously that AMD has to work on. The tokens per second benchmark in Procyon is a little better. This is just, okay, once you've done the processing and it's like, what, we need to predict the next token. We need to predict the next word in the output. This is a little better. This is a little more tolerable across several different models, Mistral 7B, Llama 3.1, and Llama 2 that are part of this benchmark. So this is also not as bad as it looks because this is 3D Mark's built-in benchmark. And the ROC part of the ROCm GitHub repository I've had some sort of amazing experiences on, especially with like Strix Halo and 128 gig stuff, which is kind of bleeding edge. It's not officially supported yet. Like there's still some stuff that has to be merged in, and there's some stuff that's unofficial. But ROCm for RDNA is moving faster than it has ever moved in the history of AMD. And I have a feeling in a couple of months, it's going to be a whole different conversation. So stay tuned for that. If you're really super into AI stuff and you want to get it running immediately, I would suggest Amuse. Check out the Amuse project, the webpage for that, image generation text. AMD's also integrated AI helpers in their Adrenalin software, so you can just talk to the AI and say, hey, how do I optimize the settings for this game? I really want Monster Hunter Wilds to be at 90 FPS all the time. And it will help you do that. It'll help you make sure that you got HyperRX turned on, or a Radeon anti-lag, or whatever is appropriate for the game that you're running, which is pretty amazing. All right, artificial benchmarks. Sorry, I digressed there for a second. 3D Mark Time Spy. It's pulling ahead a little bit of the 5060 Ti, which is nice to see. So good job, Sapphire. So in Windows, this card shapes up to be basically the best 9060 XT, but it also has the highest clock speed and the highest total board power. It makes sense. What is the Linux experience like in this configuration? Let's take a closer look at Linux. Day 0 Linux support. This is CachyOS. It's Arch Linux, but Arch Linux with a little bit of an easier installer, and they've made some other quality of life changes to make it easier to install Steam. So you can get CachyOS, you can Pacman install Steam. I would also recommend Cachy installing, or Pacman installing Flatpak and KDE applications and Discover, which is the KDE application discoverer thing. I don't generally recommend Flatpak versions of stuff. Like, I don't recommend the Flatpak version of Steam on CachyOS, for example. But things like the remote desktop tools, Remina, and maybe VLC, and a couple other things as a Flatpak install is a little easier. For whatever reason on Arch, Remina is a much more broken experience as a native package than a Flatpak. mainly owing to like decode algorithms and things like that, I guess, because you can do the remote FX algorithms, and that's just some general notes for that. But okay, Monster Hunter Wilds, look how amazing and crazy this is. Monster Hunter Wilds, the benchmark, is basically identical performance between Linux and Windows. It's maybe a little worse, just a hair worse on Linux than Windows. This is kernel 6.15, so this is bleeding edge. The bleeding edge, the Linux firmware, got the bleeding edge Mesa versions, which have, like, just as of hours ago, have performance improvements for the AMD platform. And playing with these cards on Linux for the better part of like 2 days, it is a glorious gaming experience. AMD has really nailed it. And that's true of the 9070 XT as well as the 9060 XT. This is the 16 gig version of the card. Keep in mind, I generally would not recommend the 8 gig version of the card. If you're watching this, and unless you're really sure that you know what you're doing and you need 8 gigs, just get the 16 gig version of the card. It's only about a $50 difference. So why wouldn't you do that? 16 gigs, the card's going to have a lot more longevity. It's going to work a lot better. Monster Hunter Wilds at the high preset is like 82 to 86 FPS, Windows to Linux, 9800X3D to 9800X3D, but also this platform, the 13900HX, it's a mobile CPU, doesn't turbo quite as much, still manages to do 82 FPS average in Monster Hunter Wilds. And really it's the second area of the Monster Hunter Wilds benchmark that sort of drags that average down. If you mess with the visual fidelity settings, or you want to run at a slightly, less bonkers visual fidelity, then you can play at an even higher frame rate, which is awesome on Linux. Also, Clara Obscura Expedition 33 on Linux, Day Zero support, works great. I was playing at about 70 FPS average at 1440p with the high preset, but I always turn off motion blur and chromatic aberration and vignetting and all that stuff, so just bear that in mind. Very impressive performance out of this card, Clara Obscura, at 1440p. 1080p, of course, is even higher performance. It's also non-linear, so like 1440p is not dramatically slower than 1080p, so most of the time it's worth playing at 1440p, even before we take into account upscaling and FSR4 and all that sort of stuff. Cyberpunk 2077, performance is very similar on Linux versus Windows. It's within 5%, even in a worst case scenario for ray tracing. If you use one of the presets with ray tracing disabled, like the high preset, the performance on Windows and Linux is basically identical. Doom Eternal on Linux is a first-class citizen. It works great. And, Doom Eternal and some of these, you have to toggle on the compatibility option in Steam to say, hey, let me just play random games. You can look up the Steam compatibility database, and it'll say, gold or silver for your game compatibility, but it's not, the sticker on the box is not necessarily, I'm going a little off-label when I am using these games. Look, just do it anyway. It's fine. And generally, I have a pretty good experience actually playing these games, which is awesome. Helldivers 2, I'll also call out, Helldivers 2 right now is a superior experience on Linux than it is on Windows, because the Windows anti-cheat is so jank and broken. The Linux situation with the anti-cheat on Helldivers 2 is dramatically way better. And so Helldivers 2 on Linux is a much better experience natively than Windows. Yeah, I know. It's getting to be more and more like that. So if you're like, I don't know if I like Windows 11, Linux, can I interest you in Linux and Linux accessories? It's fine. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. So one of the places where AMD had to make some cuts for cost reasons is the ray tracing aspect of this. The 9070 XT is mind-blowing how much improvement it has with ray tracing gen on gen, especially when you consider like 6,000 and 7,000 series cards from AMD. This card does have, I wish the ray tracing features of this card were a little more compelling, is what I would say there. And that sounds bad, but it's actually good. The ray tracing features of this card are actually quite good. There are only a couple of games where I was wanting for more, and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is one of those. Now, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle with path tracing may have also spoiled me, and that might be part of what I'm wishing for here, and it's just like, no, just stop. But with ray tracing, you get sun shadows and realistic foliage and that sort of thing. It can basically Like, it has a feature too where it'll try to maintain 60 FPS. It'll let you go over 60 FPS if you have a monitor like this, but it'll dynamically scale the resolution to try to maintain 60 FPS. And so Indiana Jones and the Great Circle was doing the dynamic resolution scaling to try to maintain 60 FPS at the higher visual fidelity settings with the ray tracing stuff, but not path tracing in the jungle foliage scene. But it looks great. It looks fantastic at 1440p. If you step down to 1080p, then you're talking like 70, 80, 85 FPS in these scenes with the higher visual fidelity settings. If you step it down to medium, then you can also do 80, 90 FPS at 1440p, and that is a very good gameplay real world experience. So, that I'm talking about all of this and not go to the level 1 forum and do this like arcane how-to of like 75 terminal commands in order to install it, whereas just like with Cache OS, you just, you know, install it and let it update, and then this card works on day 0. Linux is rapidly improving, and that's exciting. And this has been a quick review of the Sapphire Nitro Plus. It's the OC version. I got to send it back, so this is, if you have any questions, hit me up quick in the forum, or anything you want to have me test or take a look at, or whatever. But Steam, Linux, first class experience. Mango HUD works great. Some of the stuff for Steam Deck in terms of like power targeting and that sort of stuff also works great. Very, very impressive results for this card. All right, I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums. This is Level 1 Linux, the Linux channel. How cool and fun is that? All right, I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums.